our event. We're really looking forward for this closing because it has three very, very interesting presentations. So next we're going to welcome Henry Song. Henry is a North Korea human rights activist based in the Washington, D.C. area and the founder and executive director of the Song Foundation for North Korea Human Rights. He has been involved with this issue for over 15 years and works with North Korean defectors and activists in South Korea, Japan, Europe, and North America on various projects and programs, and volunteers for several North Korean human rights organizations founded and led by prominent defector activists like Kwon Sen, sorry for my pronunciation, Fighters for Free North Korea, Tong Kim Mong, Center of Liberty and Reunification, among others. He's also a volunteer manager for the famed director painter Song Byuk and the interpreter for North Korean defector film director Jim Joo-min. Henry has been involved with the rescue and resettlement of many of the over 200 North Korean defectors who have been admitted to the U.S. as refugees and continues to have a close relationship with them, as well as North Korean defectors in South Korea, Japan, Europe, and Canada. Please welcome Henry Song.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I guess they saved the best for last. Just kidding. This is going to be probably the only presentation that doesn't have a PowerPoint presentation, so I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm terrible at making PowerPoint slides, so I guess it's better that I just talk instead of looking at terrible PowerPoint slides. But good afternoon. Hello. It's great to be here in Medellin, Colombia, and I want to thank first and foremost Liberty International for inviting me and allowing me to speak here today at this year's conference. I want to thank Jacek and Jim and Ken and others for the invitation and giving me this great opportunity. It's my first time in Colombia, first time in South America, so I'm very excited, and I want to congratulate Maria and her colleagues, the wonderful people here, for putting on such a wonderful, fantastic conference. And before I continue, I want to mention the great folks in Mongolia who, for many various reasons, could not be here this year, for their help when I get into a little bit of quote-unquote rough spot towards the end of the conference in Ulaanbaatar 2 years ago. And without their help, I would probably either be in a prison camp in North Korea or dead. And I'll get into it a little bit later in my presentation, but I want to thank the Mongolia people and also the allied people that were there in Ulaanbaatar 2 years ago to literally save me from being abducted by the North Koreans. And so today's presentation is not going to be obviously a historical review of the North Korean regime and its human rights violations. That's literally like a grad school semester's worth of material and topic to cover. But I just want to talk very briefly about the most up-to-date update from North Korea and work from there, and also talk about what's mentioned in the title of my speech, which is the very worrisome situation in South Korea, which most people don't realize is going on in South Korea right now under the current president, Moon Jae-in. And so for this conference, my original thought was to, again, have Mr. Park Jong-ho, who was supposed to be the speaker in the 2019 Mongolian conference, but as was talked about at that time, he was approached by South Korean intelligence officials saying that it's too dangerous for you to go to Mongolia because this is last-minute intel that came in that the agents might have this intent to harm Mr. Park. So, to make long story short, I ended up being the one that spoke in Mongolia, and for this time, he is banned from leaving South Korea, and I'll get into that too. Why the South Korean government is prohibiting Mr. Park and actually a few other North Korean defectors from leaving the country, which goes under the topic of why South Korea is in such a worrisome state. And so I also want to just spend this time during the Q&A session to just have a conversation with all of you guys, because I know that, like North Korea, it's like we're in Medellin, Colombia, we're in a very nice place, nice weather, beautiful women, beautiful men too, okay? And we're talking about a depressing topic like North Korea, but I think North Korea is very important because it is the most oppressive state that is in existence on this planet. And we need to talk about this, and especially for the people that are in the libertarian cause, for the people that believe in the libertarian issues, I think to discuss, to talk about, and to worry about, and to get involved in North Korea, I think is a very important thing. So before I continue, I just want to talk a little bit about myself, how I got involved with this. I was born in South Korea, but I've lived in the US for more than 40 years now, so I consider myself Korean American. Both my parents, when the Korean War broke out in 1950, they both escaped from the northern part of the peninsula and resettled in South Korea. So you can say, I guess I have some sort of connection to the whole North Korea issue. And so back in 2002, when I was working for a distribution company for Samsung in New Jersey, making a decent living and, living the comfortable American life, I guess, that's when I first got, and before that, I had heard, growing up in Southern California in the 90s, mid-90s, after Kim Il-sung died and when North Korea entered into a period of great famine and starvation, North Korea was constantly in the news. But it wasn't until 2002, 2003 that I actually got involved with helping defectors and getting involved in North Korean human rights issue. And that was when a North Korean defector from South Korea was seeking asylum in the US, because at that time was another very pro-North Korea leftist South Korean president that was in power, and so she had some difficulty living in South Korea. So I was involved with the people that were trying to help her get resettled in the US, and that's how I guess stepped foot in this whole North Korean human rights movement and helping with the defectors. And so after that, in 2009, I moved down to DC. 2008, I was able to find a job in DC with a small think tank that was involved with helping the defectors and getting involved in North Korean human rights issues. So there might be some wondering, what does it entail as an activist involved with North Korean human rights? Well, for someone like me based in DC, before COVID, I used to host a lot of defectors that visited the US from South Korea. So I would connect them with different NGOs or different think tanks, different universities in the DC area and New York too, have speaking events to have these defectors tell their stories, because not many people know about the personal the personal suffering and the trials and tribulations that they go through to escape from North Korea. So often we hear about Kim Jong-un, the fat funny-looking leader, the nuclear issue, and oftentimes the moving stories of the people are not really talked about. So I connect them with these events. I take them to the State Department or some members of the intelligence community in the U.S. for meetings and briefings. And things like that, working with religious organizations in the U.S. to have them speak at churches and synagogues and other places of worship. And also, being in D.C., the seat of U.S. government, and with a lot of embassies and a lot of government organizations, it's the perfect place to stage protests. And this goes back to what I did in Mongolia that got myself in trouble, and unfortunately got a lot of the allied members in trouble also, is the fact that I do a lot of protests in front of the Chinese embassy, because China, as we all know, is probably the, how should I say it? I call them the scourge of the earth. They are involved in probably every bad thing that's going on in the world. And you could see CCP, the Chinese Communist Party's hand at play in whatever bad situation we're looking at. And so when it comes to North Korean defectors, when they escape from North Korea, end up in China, they're basically hunted down by the Chinese authorities, and sent back or forcibly repatriated back to North Korea, knowing that they're going to face certain imprisonment, torture, and even death. And so we've done protests in front of Chinese embassies throughout the world, especially in DC, Chinese consulates in New York City and other cities, and to try to raise awareness about China's big mistake in sending these refugees back, because China, as a signatory to the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, they are obligated to not repatriate them, but take them in and then send them on to a third country, which they can fully do. They can take them to the South Korean consulate or embassy, but instead of doing that, they just send them back to North Korea, which is mind-boggling and very evil if you think about it. And so a lot of protests. And then in the US, there's no North Korean embassy. They just have a UN mission in New York City, so we've done a lot of protests there. As was mentioned in the introduction, there are now about 230 defectors that have resettled in the US as refugees. So these are North Koreans that came straight from China or any one of the Southeast Asian countries, and did not go through South Korea, but they came directly to the U.S. As refugees. So I've been involved with a lot of different religious ministries and also organizations helping them resettle the defectors in the U.S. And there are a lot of talented defectors that have resettled in South Korea. So it was mentioned there's a very well-known painter named Mr. Song Byuk. There's a film director named Kim Gyu-min. These are North Korean defectors that have established themselves in South Korea, and they want to make their work known in the U.S. So when they come to the U.S., to D.C. or New York, they have painting exhibitions or screening events. So things like that I help organize and put together. And most recently, I've been involved with the information dissemination projects into North Korea. So I'll get into more detail in a bit, but as you know, North Korea is the most closed-off country in the world where no outside information gets into the country. So there was just news 2 days ago that this is, I guess, a week after the Tokyo Olympics ended. So only about a week afterwards did the North Korean regime, the official state television, broadcast news about the Tokyo Olympics to the people through its official TV. So during the Olympics, there was no live broadcast, no updates whatsoever, and North Korea didn't even send athletes to Tokyo this time. So I guess they felt another reason to not broadcast. But that's the sort of control that the regime has over radio, TV, and there's no obviously internet for the people. There's only the intranet for the elites to use to communicate. And so the information dissemination projects that I've been involved with for the past 2-3 years is helping defectors send USBs and leaflets into North Korea using balloons. And the latest, I guess, method or technology is using the ocean currents from the west coast of South Korea, and the currents take the bottles. These are recycled water bottles that are cleaned, that are filled with rice, because rice is a very sought-after commodity in North Korea. So we provide both humanitarian and information needs to the North Korean people. So these rice bottles filled with rice, USBs, and sometimes we've included feminine hygiene products as well, because that's very sought after in North Korea, dollar bills, as much as we can fit into the bottle. And it's amazingly, those things float. I thought they would sink, but it bobbles up and down, and it floats, and the current carries it away. It's really amazing what the defectors have done in terms of coming up with great ideas. And some defector organizations have even come up with idea of using a drone to drop leaflets and other goods into North Korea. But the cost is very high to design or buy a drone that's able to take off, go to North Korea, drop it, and come back to South Korea. And then there are other issues such as North Korea considering a fixed wing thing coming over the airspace in North Korea is considered an act of war. So there are a lot of legal issues to work out also. But you have defectors and human rights organizations coming up with really great ideas to try to reach the North Korean people with information, because information is power, knowledge is power. And when the people in North Korea wake up to the fact that they've been lied to all their lives, that's already started in North Korea. So that's why we believe, as with many North Korean defector groups and human rights organizations, that information dissemination is so important. And so that's the sort of stuff I've been involved with. And besides that, coming to wonderful places like Medellin to speak and share with you about what's going on in North Korea, that's some of the work that I do. And currently, I work as a consultant for another think tank based in DC. And that's what basically pays the rent, so to speak. But I'm able to continue to do what I'm very passionate about, which is to do North Korean human rights and to help the defectors. And so I'm going to go into an update about the current situation in North Korea under the current dictatorship of Kim Jong-un, who is the son of Kim Jong-il and the grandson of Kim Il-sung, the founder of the country. And he's been in power for about 10 years now. And the situation is, well, still terrible. No surprise there. The people are still suffering, and the regime, even though it's less secure and strong than before, it is still in charge. And another news flash is that the regime will not ever give up its nuclear ambitions. And that's something that every time I bring the defectors to DC, when they meet people from the State Department or Defense Department or other government officials, the defectors always say that to them, to these American officials. And they nod their head and as if they understand. But it seems like every time a new president comes to power, there's always nuclear talks and summits and meetings, and we all know what happens. The regime is never going to give up, because the moment they give up the nuclear weapons, that's the end of the regime, and they know it. Kim Jong-un has solidified his place in North Korea as North Korean history as the only North Korean leader to have met a sitting U.S. president, President Trump, 2 times in Singapore and Hanoi. and something that neither his father or his grandfather were able to do. And this, by far, is probably the biggest accomplishment in terms of any North Korean leader that you're looking at, because that's something both Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung really sought and really wanted, but never got. But the fact that Kim Jong-un not only once, but twice met President Trump, sitting US president, and the way they propagandized and the way they spread their propaganda throughout the country and brainwashed the people into believing that Kim Jong-un was a great leader. I think many people believe that that's a great accomplishment that Kim Jong-un did that goes even further to firmly establish Kim Jong-un as a leader in the country that no one should dare question. Other news flash, there's still mass hunger going on. UN just recently released a report saying that though there won't be the same type of mass starvation and famine that happened as it did in the 90s, late 90s and early 2000s, the UN recently, I forget which body it was, I think it was the UN, anyway, I forget the name, but they did compile a report saying that the North Korean people, unless things change dramatically, the North Korean people will still face hunger again in this year and the coming year. So people are going to still go hungry. The political prison camps are still in existence. There are now 8 of them, and with more than 200,000 people imprisoned in these places that are hell on earth. And one thing I'm very grateful to Liberty about is the fact that Liberty has invited North Korean defectors to speak and give their voice to what's going on in their own country. And I know that Shin Dong-yeok and Yeonmi Park and other people have spoken about what's going on in North Korea. So not that many people remember that there are prison camps worse than anything that ever existed in the former Soviet Union or in China or wherever, that it's still in existence in North Korea. And the sad situation is, even with the satellite information, satellite proof of what's going on in the Uyghur camps in Xinjiang province in China, people are still, we don't get much of a reaction. So you can imagine how much less attention or interest there is in the North Korean prison camps. Outside information is still very tightly controlled, and those caught watching or listening to banned content are continuing to be severely punished with fines, imprisonment, and hard labor. And one positive thing, if I can say anything positive about this, is that in the past, people were actually sent to prison camps or even executed for watching, banned content such as Hollywood films or South Korean dramas. But nowadays, because there's so much bribery going on, if you bribe with enough money, they'll let you off with a stiff fine or just being sent to a regular prison instead of a prison camp. Another aspect of North Korea that's still ongoing, that's still terrible, is the purges. Kim Jong-un perhaps is known for his purges of his uncle, Jang Sung-taek, killing his own brother, Kim Jong-nam, in the Kuala Lumpur airport in Malaysia. I actually went to the airport in Kuala Lumpur when I was visiting Malaysia 2 years ago, and it just felt very, weird walking through the terminal where Kim Jong-nam was walking. And then speaking of embassies, I also went to the DPRK embassy in Kuala Lumpur and threw some leaflets and ran to the airport before they shut down the embassy a couple of months ago. But anyway, something about North Korean embassies and myself, but we'll get more into that later. But so the purges are continuing, and it's estimated that he has purged literally tens of thousands of North Korean members of the elite, the party cadres, members of the military. And so this fear of the purges, fear of getting killed, that's gripped the entire system in North Korea, beginning with the average people to the members of the party, members of the elites. And so that fear is what's keeping him in power and compelling the people to not go out in the streets and start a rebellion or start some sort of uprising against the regime. Now, in terms of more recent news, considering the COVID pandemic, no one knows what's going on. The regime has said that there are no COVID pandemic outbreaks in North Korea, but we all know that's a total lie. One way we know that that's not true is the fact that all the major embassies that still in the past had the staff in Pyongyang, they've all evacuated their staff from Pyongyang. So the UK embassy, the Indian embassy, Russian embassy, they've all evacuated their staff from North Korea if they weren't already closed before. And so that's one sign of the fact that even the foreign embassies, they know what's going on, or maybe they were told by the North Korean officials to get out of town before things get worse, and just to keep their mouths shut about the reality of the situation on the ground. So if that's the situation in Pyongyang, which is considered the Manhattan of North Korea, you can imagine how much worse the situation probably is in the outlying provinces and smaller towns and cities in North Korea. And there are reports coming out of North Korea that there have been small pockets of outbreaks of pandemic of the the coronavirus in these small cities and towns, and that the situation will probably get worse if the North Korean regime does not get a handle on the situation, or if they don't start vaccinating people. Kim Jong-un probably got the Pfizer vaccine, but who knows? He probably wants the best, so he wants nothing but the American vaccine. So he probably refused the Sinovac, the Chinese vaccine, or the Russian vaccine. But there's a joke among defectors and people that he probably wanted the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccine. And because of the COVID lockdown, the already tense, already very difficult to escape from border area between North Korea and China. That's just been made even more hard for the North Koreans to escape North Korea. So in the years past, both the Chinese, they've upgraded their surveillance measures, and North Korea, they spent money importing foreign technology, mostly Chinese and European technology, to monitor and to make sure that no North Koreans escape from North Korea. But that's made worse by the fact that because of the lockdown, basically nobody can even get close to the border area to escape to China. So you have a situation where the people that want to escape North Korea cannot do so. And I've gotten a lot of requests and have other people request or ask about how much it's going to cost to bring people out of North Korea. In the past, before COVID, it cost about $10,000 to bring somebody out of North Korea. But now that's not even, no amount of money will be able to bring somebody out, because just the control is so tight, the surveillance is so tight that it's nearly impossible to bring somebody out of North Korea. Now, bringing somebody out of China is still difficult, but it's a lot easier than, as you can imagine, from North Korea. And then we still have defectors or refugees that are waiting to be processed in some of the Southeast Asian embassies, South Korean embassies in Southeast Asia, that are getting processed to go to South Korea. And in the last year, the number of North Korean defectors that has been resettled in the US, the number was only like 1 or 2, very, very small, because the defectors waiting to be processed by the US government, they just got so tired waiting for the process to go through, and they just ended up going to South Korea, and only 1 or 2 person was admitted to the US. So that's just a very brief, situation regarding North Korea. And you could Google News North Korea, or you could subscribe to North Korean news on Google News and get daily or weekly updates about what's going on in North Korea. And I would really recommend that you subscribe to the Daily NK or other defector-run organizations that report on the situation in North Korea, because not only are there groups and people sending information into North Korea, but there's also information coming out of North Korea, which is very important as well, because people need to know what's going on in North Korea. And because information is so tightly controlled in North Korea, people inside North Korea don't know what's going on in other parts of their own country. So when we send information back to North Korea, from the information that we brought out from other regions, from other provinces, that's very helpful, and that's very educational for the people that are able to access this type of information. So that's the situation in North Korea, and I'm going to delve into what's going on in South Korea. Now, when it comes to South Korea, many people throughout the world consider South Korea as a role model. It came out of the ashes of the Korean War, totally destroyed, and within 70 years' time became the top 11 or top 15 economy, depending on who you ask. It's K-pop and BTS and K-culture. It's all throughout the world, and people know about South Korea. People know that it was a military dictatorship, but came out of that and is now a full-fledged democracy. That's all true, but what most people don't realize is that the current president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, is steering or has steered South Korea going towards the way of North Korea, turning away from the traditional alliance of the USA and turning more towards the CCP of China and towards North Korea. And whenever we talk about, when people talk about Moon Jae-in or talk about the things that he does wrong, people get the idea that we're getting to partisan bickering and partisan attacks, which is very prevalent in South Korea. So I just want to highlight some of the recent, very worrisome moves and direction that South Korea has gone under Moon Jae-in's leadership. And so the most recent, really terrible thing that he did was last year, Kim Yo-jung, the sister of Kim Jong-un, really criticized and really got upset when North Korean defectors sent leaflets to North Korea. And the defector that sent it is a very close friend of mine. And he and his younger brother are the ones that are being investigated by police. But when Kim Yo-jong complained, that's when the North Koreans destroyed the liaison office that's in the Kaesong Industrial Complex, so the Inter-Korea Communications Office. They blew the building up. So this is the building that South Korea spent millions of dollars to build. And the North Koreans, they blew it up because they were mad at these North Korean defectors living in South Korea, sending information into North Korea. So after that, the South Korean government passed put out a decree saying that any person sending information into North Korea without the permission of the South Korean government will be fined $30,000, equivalent to $30,000, and jailed for 3 years. So this caused a huge uproar last year when this all happened. Moon and his government were roundly criticized, and rightly so, by the U.S. government, State Department, other governments, by established NGOs like HRW, Amnesty, Human Rights Foundation. They were saying that this is just like North Korea. The very government, the very people that should be supporting and funding and supporting these types of activities is actually criminalizing the act of helping their North Korean brothers and sisters. And so this is what Human Rights Watch, in one of their reports, said regarding this, the bill that was proposed, the anti-leaflet bill. Quote, the South Korean government seems more interested in keeping North Korea's Kim Jong-un happy than letting its own citizens exercise their basic rights on behalf of their northern neighbors. And so this proposal to punish the illegal sending of information to North Korea, this became law in South Korea in early this year. So now any defector, any human rights activist caught sending leaflets or sending balloons or sending water bottles or trying to cross the border to send information, if they're caught, they will be jailed for 3 years and fined $30,000. And this is it's a tremendously disappointing, to say the least, development in South Korea. And Moon Jae-in, his background is one as a human rights lawyer when he was defending people that were being targeted by the military dictatorship of South Korea in the 70s and 80s. And for this president to target and to go after these activists and defectors, it's a big disappointment. And people are saying, and rightly so, that this is only groveling to Kim Jong-un, to Kim Yo-jong, and to the North Korean regime. And so that's the situation that we have in South Korea. And 2 years ago, there was a starvation death of a North Korean defector mother and her 5-year-old son in South Korea. Now, ultimately, she decided to kill herself, so she ended up starving herself and her son and died. But this is a great, shocking news among the defector community in South Korea and just, anyone involved with the human rights issue, because the system failed her, basically. There were many systems set in place by the South Korean government over the years to make sure that no such thing will happen, that any defector needing help with employment or education or whatever you will be supported. But she fell through the crack, and she starved to death in South Korea. So many people, rightly or wrongly, but more people are saying that the Moon Jae-in government should have paid more attention to the defector community, and this would not have happened. So this is another stain on Moon Jae-in government and his North Korean defector policy. And May of this year, there was a in late 2019, there was a forced repatriation of North Korean fishermen by the South Korean government. So what happened was there was a boat filled with fishermen where they came down to South Korea, but the South Korean government claims that these 2 fishermen murdered their co-workers on the boat. So whether that's true or not, we never know, because the South Korean government sent them back to North Korea, even though these fishermen wanted to stay in South Korea. And the only reason why this became news was there was a screenshot of a government official reading a text from another government official, basically telling him to cover up or to basically, stay hush-hush about this development. So this has caused a big uproar whereby the South Korean government repatriated North Korean defectors, North Koreans that wanted to stay in South Korea, back to North Korea. Now, whether they actually killed their co-workers or not, that should have been, played out in the courts in South Korea, and if they were found guilty, they would have been sent to jail in South Korea instead of being sent to North Korea. And it was reported in May of this year that these 2 that were returned by South Korea were executed by the North Korean authorities. One more. There was a South Korean maritime civil servant that apparently the North Korean said that he wanted to defect, and he swam out to the ocean. Basically, he was shot by the North Korean Navy, and his body was burned, and they just left it at that. But the South Korean government, not a word regarding confronting the North Korean government about returning the body or doing an investigation. Basically, just ignored the plight of the family members that were left to deal with, their father, their brother, and their son that was killed and burned by the North Korean officials. And then, more disturbingly, the Moon Jae-in government has cut off or has not renewed funding for many defector organizations, and they've also investigated many defector organizations or auditing them, basically harassing them to try to pressure them to not be involved with information sending projects into North Korea. So that's the situation in South Korea. So many people see this as a very worrying situation. So that's just Moon Jae-in and dealing with North Korean human rights and North Korean defectors. But other policy-oriented actions that he's taken in terms of, siding more with the CCP and, acting like he's more mindful of not upsetting the North Korean regime instead of taking care of his own citizens and turning away from the US. Those are the more worrisome developments in South Korea. And South Korea has a presidential election happening next March. And many are worried that and thankfully it's only one 5-year single term in South Korea for the president. And many are worried that if another progressive or quote-unquote pro-North Korean leftist candidate wins the presidency, he or she will finish whatever Moon Jae-in started. And that doesn't bode well for the future of South Korea. And one last example I'll give is August 15th, which is yesterday, right? That's the Liberation Day for South Korea. That's when Japan surrendered to the US in the World War II, and a lot of the countries that Japan colonized, they gained their independence. One alarming sign of this sort of North Koreanization of South Korea is the fact that instead of displaying that's the 30-minute mark alarm. Instead of displaying the South Korean flag, they display what's called the peninsula flag. And you've seen this in some sporting events when North Korean and South Korean athletes enter together. It's the shape of the Korean peninsula, but blue color. But it doesn't represent South Korea. And August 15th is South Korean Independence Day. But for some cities in South Korea to display this flag instead of the South Korean flag was very upsetting to many people. And it's unfortunate because when it comes to, the North Korean human rights, many people feel that it's a partisan issue. In South Korea, many people say that, only if you're conservative or if you're right-wing, you are supporting North Korean human rights. The liberals and the progressives, we're all about engagement and unification and, being chummy with the North Korean regime. And that's a very sad situation because in the US, I have many friends who are total, MAGA supporting Trump, Trump lovers, and you have, Biden and, Obama loving people who, when it comes to North Korean human rights, we're all in the same boat. Whereas in South Korea, that's not the case. So it's very worrisome overall in terms of the situation in South Korea. How much time do I have? 10 minutes?
Yes,
So I'll just wrap up then. Yeah, let me wrap up.
We have 5 minutes.
Yeah, got it, okay. And so wrapping up, North Korea is considered the worst human rights violator in the whole world, where the citizens don't enjoy a single right as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And things certainly have not improved in the 10 years since Kim Jong-il died and Kim Jong-un has come to power. But if there's one hopeful thing that I can say is that North Koreans are a strong, resilient people. I just look at the people that have resettled in South Korea that are doing well, and in the U.S., the ones that have resettled in the U.S. that are doing well, and the UK and elsewhere that are doing well. And so there's great hope for the defectors and for North Korea. I'll end with this. So for those of you in Colombia, well, I'm in Colombia, I'm in Medellin. What can I do for North Korean rights? North Korea seems so far away. The defectors, North Koreans, it's such an alien concept to me. How can I get involved? What can I do? Well, there are plenty of things you can do. I mean, obviously right now because of COVID, we can't really travel or invite defectors from South Korea. But if you're a university student, when the lockdown lifts up, maybe you could form an organization or form a project to invite a North Korean defector from South Korea or from the US to come and speak on your college campus or in your church or in your organization or wherever. You can collect USBs used USBs. We'll clean them out and put content into them and send them into North Korea when things improve in terms of the anti-leaflet bill. We're hoping when the new president comes in, he or she will abolish the bill, but that's one thing you can do. You can petition I checked if there's a Chinese consulate here. Apparently not here, but there's an embassy in Bogota. So you could petition the Chinese embassy to stop repatriating North Korean defectors. You could petition the South Korean embassy to deliver a message to the South Korean government to care more about North Korean human rights, to care more about North Korean defectors. There are many things that all of you here in Colombia can get involved with for the peace in the peninsula and for the reunification of South and North Korea and for the freedom of North Korean people. North Korea obviously is the very opposite of what libertarians stand for, what the libertarian ideals stand for. But I think, and I said this before in Mongolia, I think we can work together to work towards a free North Korea to happen one day. And my dream, as I said in Mongolia, is to have a Liberty International Conference in a free Korean peninsula and liberated Pyongyang in our lifetime. Wouldn't that be a great thing? And teach the people in North Korea, and teach the people in North Korea what it means to live in freedom. And finally, I want to close with this. Although I lived in the US for 40 years, I was born in South Korea, and I grew up for a time in the 70s and 80s when South Korea was still developing. And I want to take this time to thank and express my deepest gratitude and appreciation to Colombia, I don't know, I'm getting emotional, for sending soldiers to fight in the Korean War. Colombia is the only country from South America that sent soldiers to fight in the Korean War. And up to 5,000 Colombian soldiers fought bravely to defend South Korea from communist aggression. And 131 Colombians died in combat. And 76 soldiers were injured. 69 disappeared. They were probably captured and sent and taken away by North Koreans or Chinese. And 30 were taken as POWs and most likely returned at the end of the war. And unfortunately, like many soldiers that fought in the Korean War, when Colombian soldiers came back to Colombia, they were ignored and forgotten by many here in Colombia. But South Koreans never forgot, and neither have I. So I just want to thank you. And let's hope for and pray for and work towards a free North Korea. So I'll take questions now. Thank you.
Fascinating stuff there, Mr. Song. Thank you very much. And do send us the links so we can help any way we can through the chat that we have.
Yes, thank you.
That would be fantastic. So we're going to start this way.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to know what other actors do you think are involved in the situation in South Korea, like besides China, that you think that are actors in a negative way, that just benefits from all the conflict and all the situation?
So speaking of actors involved with this whole issue in South Korea, there are a lot of North Korean spies in South Korea, and there are a lot of South Koreans who have been brainwashed into believing this whole communist, socialist, pro-North Korean ideology. And the funny thing is, they don't ever want to live in North Korea, but they want to stay in South Korea, enjoy the benefits of living in a country like South Korea, but they want to, I would say, the word I would use is infect or brainwash or affect other people in South Korea to try to hate the South Korean government, South Korean democracy, hate the U.S. and hate Japan and praise Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime. So you have the Chinese influence. The Chinese influence in South Korea is very strong. There's still Confucius institutes that have not been closed down fully in South Korea. The overall presence of Chinese investment and Chinese influence is strong and is only growing stronger in South Korea. And many people feel that unless things are dealt with in terms of the Chinese influence, China may well become another vassal state. South Korea may become another vassal state of China, like in the past history. So that's a very serious concern. So I don't know if that's answered your question, but
yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.
Henry, hi. The first is, let us, here in Colombia, build again a group of veterans from Colombia to help South Korea and North Korea. Because, yes, of course, we share this history, and I know personally some veterans from there.
That's great.
One of them has died like 3 years before, but we need to share more this experience, and also with the exercise, the battle nature exercise, we were involved too with our submarines and things like that. So for sure, for Colombian defense policy to maintain, for whatever reason, maintain or trying to liberate North Korea could be really important for us, for our history, and I can share a lot of things about it. But I want to share other things because it would be important for your angle and perspective. We need to denounce really, really hard the history of the Nobel Prize of Colombia, that his name is Juan Manuel Santos, because he did the same thing, or even worse, that the president of South Korea is doing with the persons that are going far from North Korea. Juan Manuel Santos permitted the kidnapping of Lorenz Saleh, a student who was really against Maduro regime and was kidnapped with the permission of Juan Manuel Santos, a Nobel Prize, and give to Maduro. So maybe we can share one message here, and is we don't forget the people who make these kind of things to the people who is running to the dictatorships. So try to work with that, and we talk later maybe. But you have friends here.
Thank you. That's a very good comment you bring about the veterans, because there are many churches and groups in South Korea that invite U.S. veterans of the Korean War to South Korea to visit, but I don't think there have been any outreaches to Colombian veterans. I believe there's less than 1,000 alive in Colombia. So as more time passes by, time is of the essence. But I think Korea is one prime example of where the U.S. and other allies' blood spilled was not in vain. I mean, despite the current situation in South Korea with Moon Jae-in and stuff, South Korea, going from the ashes of war to being a aid-giving nation and being such a, going through all that process to become where it is, I think actually all veterans are very proud of the fact that they served in Korea. So I think, yes, that's a very good point. I would love to talk to you afterwards. Thank you. Hey, Kyle.
Hey, so I understand right now, given the COVID situation, it's not easy, or maybe not even possible to get people out of North Korea now, but I don't think that situation will persist forever. And I was hoping you could walk us through the mechanics of what it looks like to get somebody out of North Korea and to resettle them in a free country, and maybe also the economics of that. You said $10,000. Sounds like a low price to buy freedom for somebody to be.
So thank you, that's a great question. So before it was like $3,000 to bring somebody to North Korea, but what would happen is if there is a relative that resettled in South Korea want to bring his or her family member relatives out of North Korea, he or she would contact a broker in China, and this China would contact another broker or contact person in North Korea, or he would actually go into North Korea and bring that person out. That's where the money, it costs so much, because you'd have to bribe people along the way. So this person would either go in or hire somebody in North Korea to escort the person out of North Korea to the border area, cross the river, and once in China, they're either handed off to a religious group or a church or a human rights organization, and that person would take them through south of China to try to go to Thailand. Thailand is the target country because Thailand does not repatriate refugees back to China. Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos, they have done so, even though refugees that still end up in those countries, if they go to the South Korean embassy or U.S. embassy, they are safe. But they're having cases where they've been caught on the journey, so it's a very dangerous journey. The journey through China itself is very dangerous, but once they end up in those Southeast Asian countries, except for Thailand, it's very dangerous. And once they end up in an embassy compound, if it's a South Korean embassy, then they'll be processed to go to South Korea, which takes less than a couple of weeks. If they decide to, if they end up in a U.S. consulate or U.S. embassy, then that's when the waiting game starts. Because in the past, I know a defector who eventually came to the U.S., but she waited literally 2.5 years, and she was stuck in the U.S. embassy. Of course, they fed her and whatever. They didn't kick her out or anything, but just the whole process of the interviewing, the vetting, and all that process took over 2 years, and many North Korean defectors actually gave up because they were so tired of waiting and ended up in South Korea. Now they regret not having waited out because they consider the situation in South Korea very poor to be living as a defector. They're like, oh, I wish I stayed in the U.S. embassy and decided to, stick it out and, end up in the U.S. A lot of defectors want to come to the U.S. because they think it's a lot better place to live than in South Korea. But anyway, so that's the very brief synopsis of the journey of a North Korean when they escape from North Korea, going through China, and ending up in a Southeast Asian country and then coming to the US or South Korea. Now, in the past, some defectors, refugees, if they had enough money, they didn't need to go through the Chinese, it's called the Underground Railroad for, using the same term used for the Civil War era. They don't have to go through China, end up in a Southeast Asian country. They just stay in China, and they had enough money to get fake passports and then go directly to South Korea. We call that the express route, but that can't happen anymore because the biometrics and the fake, you can't fake the biometrics and the fake passports like they did in the past because there weren't any chips in the passports in the past. So, and then right now in the South Korean facility where they accept and where they re-educate, well, that's not the right word, where they educate the North Koreans into South Korean society. It's called Hanawon. I think within the last year, they only accepted, it's a facility meant to house literally hundreds, if not up to 1,000 North Korean refugees, but they only accepted like a dozen. And of course, COVID plays a big part into this, but that's how, I guess, precarious the situation is right now in terms of the situation and compounded very greatly by the COVID lockdown. So right now it's like $10,000, maybe more, to bring them out of North Korea, but that's nearly impossible. Bring them out of China is a lot more doable. The last time I heard, China, the cost is about anywhere from $700 to about $1,500, $2,000, depending on which organization or which group you need to talk to. And it's all about money because you have to pay these brokers, whether good or bad, to safely bring these defectors, refugees out of China. And speaking of Mongolia, the first time I was in Mongolia was to facilitate refugee rescue from the northern border of China and the southern part of Mongolia, obviously. But the plan failed because the defector couldn't make it to the Mongolia-China border. So I ended up just coming back, and then 4 years later, I went to Mongolia again. Then, yeah.
As a follow-up, is there a large population of North Korean defectors stuck in China right now?
Yes, anywhere estimated from about 100,000 to 200,000. So a lot of these are women, North Korean refugee women, who are sold into human trafficking situations. So a lot of them feel that it's safer to stay in this unwanted forced marriages, basically human trafficking marriages, than to try to escape from China. And ironically, there are few cases where these forced marriages ended up being loving marriages, you can call it that, where the husband was really nice, really loving, and really cares about the woman, even though he bought his wife and had kids. It's a very terrible situation if you think about it. So right now they're basically staying put. And so the number, again, nobody can do an accurate estimate, but it's anywhere from 100,000 to 200,000 North Korean refugees in China.
What effect has the recent crackdown on Hong Kong by the Chinese central government had on South Korea's appeasement of North Korea? I understand that it has caused Japan to strengthen their alliance with Taiwan.
Great question. So regarding...
Sorry, excuse me. I'm going to do, because this subject is very interesting, I got carried away with the questions. I'm going to do 3 questions in a row,
Okay.
And then you can answer all 3. I'm sorry to do this, but I want to hear his opinions and then Ken.
Hi, my name is Maria and I am from Venezuela. And thanks for your presentation, it was awesome. And I wanted to know what, in your opinion, what is the way to fix the damage did because the collectivists in Korean Peninsula.
And now Ken, sorry, and then you can summarize.
I just want to applaud you so much for your courage. You've devoted your whole life to this, and why?
Good question. So I'll start off with the first question. So when all these Hong Kong protests, democratic protests happened in Hong Kong, not a word from the South Korean government and not a word from Moon Jae-in, because he knows that the moment he talks anything about supporting these activists and these protesters, he knows that he would get severely, chewed out by Xi Jinping and the CCP. So it's very ironic for somebody who claims to be human rights lawyer, the president for all people. he has not said any word of support for the Hong Kong protesters. And that all plays into the whole direction that Moon Jae-in is taking in terms of basically not trying to piss off Xi Jinping and the CCP and not trying to provoke the North Korean regime and Kim Jong-un. And same thing with, it's interesting, Moon Jae-in did talk about the Burma coup d'etat very little bit, but when it came to the Hong Kong protesters, there was no official word from Moon Jae-in in terms of words of support, words of encouragement for these protesters in Hong Kong. And I'm sorry, what was the second question? Maria, your question, what was your question again? Sorry, I forgot.
What, in your opinion, what is the way to reverse the damage about for collectivism in the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I mean, that's like the $64,000 question, I guess. How to reverse, all that? Some people, okay, so some North Koreans, they wish war would happen because they say, I wish war would happen, Americans would just bomb the heck out of Kim Jong-un so we can get rid of this regime. And that's a very, pessimistic, very fatalistic viewpoint, obviously. But, I don't think there's a way to reverse what's happened so far. I think the only way to, I guess, undo or reverse it is for unification to happen between North and South Korea, but not under the terms of the North, obviously. Because if South Korea gets absorbed into North Korea, then you can kiss South Korea goodbye. It has to be South Korea absorbing North Korea into a free capitalist, democratic, open system, society, instead of the communist, socialist, dictatorial system that North Korea wants to do. And there's a movement right now in South Korea and in the US where there are many calling for an official end to the war, because most people don't realize the Korean War has not ended officially. It's just an armistice. There's like a stop to the war. But if there is an official end to the war, the reason why these pro-North Korean and pro or anti-US people are supporting this movement is, if there's an end to the war, there's no need for US forces to stay in Korea. So they have to leave. But what's going to happen if the US forces leave? The North is going to invade. It's an open invitation for the North Korean army to invade South Korea, although many say that he doesn't need to invade because the invasion has already started within South Korea, but that's a whole other topic. But so there's this whole movement currently going on in Congress in the US and in South Korea, where they're trying to end the war and get the US forces out. But when that happens, it will make Afghanistan look like child's play, basically, I think. And it's very unfortunate what's happening in Afghanistan right now. But and then to your question, Ken, I don't know. That's a great question. I ask that myself all the time also. My parents, they came to the US not as immigrants, but they came here for a job, my dad's job, and then we ended up just we're settling down in the US. So we're not your typical immigrant family story, but my brother became a doctor, so in the Asian American parents' eyes, they had a great success with my older brother. He became a doctor, and then they look at me, they're like, you're an activist. What are you doing? So it's kind of a family joke right now, but I would say I can't just not do anything when my own people, North Korean people, are suffering and they're not enjoying the freedom that I and others are enjoying living in the US or Colombia or South Korea or elsewhere. So for me, it's more of a calling, I guess, to be involved with this, to help the defectors. So that's why I'm doing this. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give him some.
Thank you. Thank you.